And now we move on to Roman numeral 4, Hispanic Americans. Now, when it comes to minority issues, the Hispanic American experience is different from that of the African American and the Native American experience, just because, among other things, Hispanic Americans, there's not as much unity within the community, if you will. Whereas the African American community is largely dealing with the same history, if you will, same with the Native Americans. Hispanic American includes everything from the Mexican Americans to South Americans to Caribbean to Cuban, which is part of the Caribbean. But my point being that there's a larger diversity of issues. The other major difference that you see within the Hispanic community versus, say, the African American and the Native American community is the language barrier. Whereas African Americans and Native Americans, especially in modern times, all don't face a language barrier. Hispanic Americans still largely do, and that language barrier rather helps to fuel a lot of the discrimination and other issues that we'll talk about. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So we start at the first letter, which is history/growth. The Hispanic American movement in the United States is, as you would probably guess, based around primarily the Southwest, which is to say the border with Mexico. The first major influx of Mexican immigration, well, here's what I mean, is that most of the major waves of immigration from the Hispanic Americans have largely been involuntary. For example, one of the first major waves was when we added a third of Mexico following the Mexican-American War. As a result of the Mexican-American War, the United States picked up 1/3 of Mexico, which would today be Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, well, parts of Texas at least, California, Nevada, Utah. All of that area was added to the United States, and all of those Hispanic Americans suddenly became American. All those Mexican citizens are now brand new Americans. Otherwise, the next major wave was during World War II. Remember the Bracero program, where we actually encouraged Mexicans to move to the United States. Otherwise, the movement of Hispanic Americans, for the most part, really wasn't that fluid until you hit the later half of the 20th century. The problem is that in the later half of the 20th century, instability in South America, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, instability in those regions has caused for a large number of refugees coming to the United States, looking for economic, political, and social freedom. And so that's where the growth is coming in. Because of the instability in those regions, there's a much larger movement of refugees and immigrants looking for a better life. So much so that Hispanic Americans are now the second largest ethnic group in the United States, first being white. But Hispanic Americans have passed African Americans to become the second largest group. Now, the problem is that such a large amount of growth in such a short period of time has led to a very big polarized reaction, and oftentimes a lot of backlash, which brings us to letter B, which is reaction. The reaction to the Hispanic movement, as it was to almost every other immigration group, has been, largely hesitant and, rejection and so forth. In particular, again, because of the language issue. Hispanic Americans largely speak Spanish, based on the name. And so, as a result, one of the ways to reject them, if you will, or to interfere with them or to deal with them, whatever phrase you wish to use, has been the English-only movement. English-only movements saw a big rise in the late 90s and early 2000s, again, as immigration picked up. These would be laws that require English only to be the government language. For example, in California, they passed a law saying that you could only teach in English. Because many schools were trying bilingual education. Other states tried to pass laws that said all government documents could only be in English and could never be printed in Spanish. And the reason behind that, the argument for it is that it creates a unified culture and English is so, our dominant language and so forth. But the more sinister explanation behind it is that it is to make the immigrant's life more difficult. If they can't speak the language, then they can't fill out the paperwork. And if they can't fill out the paperwork, then they can't get on Medicare and Medicaid and start taking our jobs and shagging our women and everything else that you hear, the people say. One of the arguments that always comes up, is that, English is, the language of America, and that's not exactly true. There is no official language of the United States. And so that's why, a lot of the English-only movement is somewhat disingenuous to say that, we have to preserve the American language and so forth. It's one of those things where, when the Irish came over, we tried to pass laws that said you had to be Protestant to be elected to government because most Irish were Catholic. When the Asians were here, as we'll talk about in the next chapter, during World War II, there were movements that said, to try to stop them from being able to use their language and so forth. So the English-only movement is not, I mean, it's not quite as pure as it may seem. Like, it's not really about the English language. It's really much more about trying to control immigration and so forth. Which brings us to modern issues. And of course, one of the other big issues when it comes to Hispanic Americans is illegal immigration, because unfortunately a large percentage of the illegal immigrants are Hispanic. And so these two issues sort of get conflagrated. We're not sure that's the word I'm looking for, but it's late at night and my brain's a little fuzzy. Uh, Illegal immigration, legal immigration oftentimes get sort of mixed up in this argument over Hispanic Americans because, again, a large percentage of illegal immigrants are Hispanic. It's one of those where not all Hispanics are illegal and not all illegals are Hispanic, but a large number of illegals are Hispanic. And so as a result, you oftentimes get these two arguments mixed together, which is problematic to say the least. The short version is that the reason why that's important is because, again, a lot of this arguments about illegal immigration is, again, sort of mixed with the anti-Hispanic demographic. There's a lot of bleed over, if you will, from the people who don't like any Hispanics to the people who are talking all about illegal immigration and vice versa. And again, the problem is that when we lump everything together, then you sort of ignore the fact that there are an awful lot of legal Hispanic immigrants, not to mention the fact that you're sort of, again, ignoring a lot of the other issues as we talked about with legal and illegal immigration. But again, it's one of those things where they probably shouldn't be smushed together like this, but they kind of are. So unfortunately, a lot of the issues relating to the Hispanic community are tied in with illegal immigration. I mean, even look at like today's debate and things like that when we're talking about, build the wall and so on and so forth. In theory, on paper at least, that's only talking about illegal immigration. But if you listen to a lot of the rhetoric, they're talking about all immigration, which is, again, kind of problematic. But that's the modern issue when it comes to Hispanic issues. The other problem facing a lot of Hispanic Americans is that even though they're the second largest minority, politically Hispanic Americans are not that powerful. And this is because they have, historically speaking, been less willing to participate than other ethnic groups. Their turnout rate is much, much lower than, say, African Americans or Asian Americans. And so as a result, politicians don't listen to them as much. For example, like in states like Arizona and Texas and New Mexico, Hispanics are a majority of the voting population, and yet when it comes time to actually vote, they come in usually like third behind African Americans and Caucasians. And so as a result, the Hispanic community's voice is oftentimes diluted and ignored. Now, as for why they choose not to vote, there are a whole host of explanations for it, whether it be barriers to difficulty to reluctance over a lack of seeing why this is important and so forth. But the short version is that because they choose not to vote and participate, politicians don't pay attention to them. Because politicians don't pay attention to them, they choose not to vote and participate. It's a chicken and the egg kind of question. But because they, again, are generally viewed as less important or less politically valuable, their issues get lost in the shuffle. So, that's Roman numeral 4. Click on to the next one for Roman numeral 5, in which we talk about Asian Americans.